Hi, I'm Martin Rafael, and I'm going to talk about some important aspects to consider when we approach language in a classroom. These are input, interaction, and context. It is very common that whenever we talk about language in the classroom, we take into consideration the individual aspects of learning and the teaching strategies. We spend a lot of time planning how our students are going to achieve the learning outcome or how we can teach better, but sometimes we overlook an entire aspect which depends mostly on us, teachers, which is classroom context. Now, context itself is defined by Merriam-Webster as the interrelated condition in which something exists or occurs, and it is known informally as the environment or the setting. But even if we understand the definition, if we want to talk specifically about a classroom context, it is still a very broad term, which comprises several different characteristics. So let's see some of them. The first characteristic I want to talk about is input and how it is related to learning. In language learning, input is the second language that the individual learner is exposed to. This means that all the information that a student gets in his or her target language is going to be called input. For example, a radio show, a TV show, an advertisement, a newspaper, textbooks or literary books, signs, conversations with friends or relatives. They're all going to aid the student's learning process of their target language. Of course, as long as they are in the language the student is learning. Input is very helpful and it establishes the difference between EFL and ESL. When we refer that learners are studying English as a second language, we infer that they live in a context where English is spoken or at least where they are exposed to the language most of their time outside the classroom. On the other hand, when we refer to English as a foreign language, the students are barely exposed to the language, and it is likely that the only moment in which they are fully and unconsciously exposed is during the English lesson. By understanding this difference, we can see why input is important in the classroom, especially if we are in an EFL context. We must make sure that students are getting enough input. In words of Krashen and Spolsky, the more time we spend learning any aspect of the second language, the more will be learned. But unfortunately, quantity is not enough to learn a language. Otherwise, people will learn any language only by listening to podcasts or watching TV shows all day long. We must make sure that learners understand the information they are getting. Cushing calls it comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is represented with the expression I plus 1, in which I represents the current level of competence. This is my current level or the current level of the students. And 1 represents the next level of the competence in the natural acquisition process. This means that the input we offer must be slightly more advanced than the level of the student. Therefore, if we play a news program for children who are on a basic level, it would be just as useless as playing an audio of the past participle form of the verbs for advanced students. Instead, if we show the children a video about a kid talking about their daily activities and focusing on the days of the week, and to the advanced students, if we play a short podcast about current global issues, which include certain forms of the past participle of the verbs, that would be more appropriate since the information is going to be understandable for students, yet it's going to be challenging since it's going to require them to understand and use the language in a specific situation. Also, we need to take into consideration that input should be presented with certain frequency. In this case, we refer to frequency as the number of times an individual hears or sees a specific target language form. Let's say if we offer input that uses the present continuous tense for 2 weeks, it's going to be more useful than if we only present it for 1 week. Because the more the students are in contact with the different language structures, the more they would identify and produce them. Along with input, we have a similar term which is called intake. Intake is the input that is actually processed by the individual learners during a specific moment in the learning process. For example, imagine you work with basic level students. And last week we were studying about likes and dislikes. So I decided to show them an interview of one of their favorite singers. And I chose this specific interview because the singer mentions his or her likes and dislikes. Even if it includes language forms that we have not seen in class, but that maybe my students would be able to understand from context. So I am providing comprehensible input for my students. They might get the gist of the full interview and the part which they would actually comprehend about likes and dislikes will be called intake. In order to transform input into intake, we need to make sure that the language data is presented in a manner in which it stimulates its possible assimilation and that the content is compatible with the individual's previous linguistic knowledge. If we notice that a student may have difficulties, we can use personalized input by using concrete reference and simplified language. What we must have in mind all the time when presenting input is that we should have a positive atmosphere in the classroom. So learning is going to be easier. Now let's talk about interaction. As we know, a student is not an empty vessel waiting to be filled with input. Learners are supposed and expected to have an active role in their learning process, especially in the classroom and even more in an EFL classroom, which would be one of the few opportunities they have to use the language they are learning. When we talk about interaction, we come across another term, which is the opposite of the one that we just saw. It is called output. According to Gratian's theories, comprehensible input was enough to learn a language, but Swain came up with the output hypothesis, which considers the learner production of the language as the most important element when learning a second language. This hypothesis suggested that chances of successful language acquisition are higher when the individual has the opportunity of organizing his or her output during interaction with their interlocutor. And who are the interlocutors in the classroom? Their classmates and the teacher. So promoting interaction within the classroom will allow the students to notice the gap between what they want to say and what they can actually say. So they are more likely to recognize their linguistic problems and what they need to solve them. Also, by interacting, learners have an opportunity to check their knowledge and give a try to the good old test-error approach. They would produce their own language structure and they will see if they work or they don't. An accurate production will boost their confidence, and an error will encourage them to use different cognitive and metacognitive strategies, so they will be able to reflect on the use of the language and internalize the linguistic knowledge. We can consider output any type of language production the learner performs, but when they interact with each other, it is highly common that another process takes place. It is called negotiation. So negotiation occurs when one of the participants in an interaction does not understand what the other is saying. So the speaker needs to restructure what it is being said, or in other words, the speaker needs to modify his or her output. During negotiation, the speakers will retrieve knowledge and look for clues so that the message is understood. And it is believed that this kind of interaction is one of the most significant for a language learner. Now let's move on to context again. By understanding how input and interaction work and their importance within the classroom, we can say that the type, quality, and frequency of input, as well as the interaction opportunities the teacher provides, will affect directly to the classroom context. However, these are not the only factors which affect context itself. To start, we can classify context in the formal classroom context and the natural context. Natural contexts are the ones that we encounter in our daily lives. And in this case, a natural context for language learning would be living surrounded by native speakers and the target language. In a natural context, communication with native speakers is common, and it is a great benefit since the learner would be exposed to the language itself in real life. Therefore, the student can learn something with every interaction. However, Not all interactions have the desired impact due to multiple factors, such as the speaker's disposition, level of target language, age, and the subject of the conversation. The native speakers may have a regression or adaptation of the language in order to be understood by the non-native speaker, and negotiation is more likely to occur. Okay. Even though natural context is considered to be ideal, we know that it is not possible in all cases. So we can learn a language in a formal context. Formal context refers to classroom-type situations, and in this type of setting, the student spends a lot of time focused on a specific language feature. However, the communicative potential is limited and determined by many aspects, such as the level, age, and number of students. On a positive note, the individual who learns in a formal context acquires conscious knowledge of certain specific competences as they move forward to different levels. In terms of language use, language is meant to be used in a natural context, but teachers have the ability to recreate these natural settings within the classroom. Also, learners have the opportunity to observe and practice the language. Within the formal classroom context, there are 5 characteristics that are important: teacher talk, interaction, discourse, feedback, and tasks. Teacher talk is the special language used by the teacher in the classroom. Basically, all the adjustments that we do to our speech in order to achieve a specific goal and have an effect on the classroom context. In the case of interaction, we need to make sure that the speech has a medium register, which is understandable for most of our students, and we must simplify our speech if it is necessary. Discourse and feedback work together, and they can be mechanical, meaningful, semi-communicative, or real communicative, depending on the situation. And if we analyze the students' discourse, we might want to provide feedback by giving them clues so that they can restructure their output or allow the error to go unnoticed in order to provide feedback in a later lesson. Finally, tasks are going to vary depending on the level of the students, but specific tasks are part of the daily classroom context, and some can be more challenging than others. For example, tasks such as information gap, to more difficult ones such as debates. In conclusion, in order to teach English, we need to take into account several things. But while we are planning, we have to make sure that we are providing a positive context for our students and with enough opportunities for them to learn according to their level and requirements. Thank you.